Excellent. Thank you so much, Maddie. It's a real pleasure to be here today, to have these distinguished panelists and to be convening this conversation. This event is part of IIPP's, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. It's part of our 2022 public event series, which is focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. And this talk in particular, we've called What's Tax Got to Do with It? Business Reporting and the SDGs. I'm Dr. Kate Roll. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where I'm a political scientist and do lots of teaching and research. And I became interested in this question through some work that IIPP did with the Spanish government, which I'll speak about down the line. But first, I wanted to do a little bit of scene setting, and then I'll introduce our panelists. So this talk, of course, sort of starts with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the idea that all states in the General Assembly signed up to the 2030 agenda. And in signing up and taking on this challenge of realizing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the 169 targets, and then the 232 indicators, so a big piece of work, these need to be realized through their own policies, through state investment in things like education and health. And states also have a role through their tools, through their policies, to push and encourage non-state actors to advance the SDGs, including companies. And taxation in particular has become an interesting part of this conversation as a tool for doing both this first part, realizing the SDGs through a country's own policies, but also as a tool to shift behavior, incentivize action, and build markets. So we're going to be looking at taxation, but also expanding the conversation out into questions about responsibility of corporations, the role of the state, issues around international political economy, aid, and even colonialism. So it's going to be a really interesting 90 minutes. So without further ado, I'll introduce, or I'll name our distinguished panelists, and then actually I'll ask them to do a little bit more of the introduction for themselves. But first we have Professor Kenneth Amaeshi, who is the chair in sustainable finance and governance at the EUI School of Transnational Governance. Next, we're joined by Dr. Waziri Ligomeka, who's on the United Nations Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters and works on tax in Malawi. And then Dr. Bernadette OHara, who's a senior lecturer in global health at the University of St. Andrews. And like I said, we'll do a little bit more introduction, some scene setting, and then we'll have two opportunities for doing Q&A. First, in the first half, and we'll deepen the conversation. We'll do some more Q&A, and then we'll go back to the panelists for their closing reflections and advice. But without further ado, I would like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves a little bit more, but also to really talk about how did you become interested in issues around the SDGs, around tax, around corporations? What brought you to these questions? And let's start. We'll start with Bernadette. We'll go in reverse order to the original introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bernadette OHara, and I'm a senior lecturer in global health at the University of St. Andrews. I also work at the University of Malawi in the Kamuzu University of Health Sciences, where I teach public health. Now, I've worked in both high and low income countries, and I've had the privilege of working in Africa for 10 years, mostly as a pediatrician, and most recently in Malawi since 2010. I became interested in the issues around the SDGs after working in both of these settings and observing the stark differences in health outcomes. And these differences were largely due to the level of access that people have to the determinants of health. So while when we think of health, we always think of hospitals and facilities, but really the determinants of health lie outside these places largely. And people come to the hospitals whenever something's gone wrong, they've developed bad health in the community. So access to these determinants of health, people are very reliant, particularly poor families, on public services. including safe water, safely managed sanitation, a good free education, and it's very important to live in a country with good infrastructure, good roads, electricity, etc. So focusing on why people didn't have good public services led me to focus on public spending, and then the reverse of that coin, of course, is government revenue, 70% of which comes from taxes in lower income countries. And that led me to think of the revenue gaps, and I started to think about both international and domestic tax gaps. And experts in the field reported that reducing the international tax gap was probably one of the most feasible and the quickest way in the short term to increase government revenue in lower income countries. And that's why that has been the focus of my work over the last couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. Wazi, will you come in next?
Yeah, thank you, Kate, and thank you for having me, and good afternoon to everyone. Yes, so my name is Waziri Okello, as Kate has introduced me. I'm with the Ministry of Finance in Malawi, but I have also worked and continue to work very closely with the Malawi Revenue Authority. But as it's already been said, I'm also a member of the UN Tax Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters. So my background really is about tax. Everything to do tax, that's what I've been working on for about 17 years now, just looking at taxation. And because I've mainly worked with the government, through the Ministry of Finance, the issue of SDGs, how can we achieve the targets in the SDGs? You always have to come back to the issue of taxation. How can governments collect more tax revenues more effectively, more efficiently? And that's the question we struggle with, because we think if we have answers to this, then we should be able to finance the SDGs and reach the targets. So that's my interest, how it got into SDGs and taxation. Thank you.
Thank you, and Kenneth.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or evening where you are. My name is Kenneth Amos, and I'm a professor of business and sustainable development at the University of Edinburgh, but I'm currently on leave of absence at the European University Institute as a professor of sustainable finance and governance. I think the question in terms of how I stumbled on tax is an interesting one, because I'm originally from Nigeria and I know how governments in Africa behave. So I've always thought that could be alternatives, because I lost interest in governments. And I was kind of thinking of how the private sector can be part of the solution, as opposed to, I know, the private sector is often seen as the problem, but there are circumstances where I would not see the private sector as contributing to solving the problem, which led me to my research on Afro-capitalism, Afro-capitalism being the private sector contribution to development. And within that conversation then is the function of tax. How can corporations share the benefits with society? And how can taxation just go beyond just mere compliance to do more than that and foster development in the true sense of it? But then there is a problem. How do individuals with private interests sacrifice, and how do you also avoid taking advantage of loopholes when consultants and professional services firms are pushing from all corners to ensure that you engage in strategic tax planning, which is framed as a positive thing? So for me, that paradox in itself is quite interesting. As much as companies want to showcase themselves as being responsible, how can they extend that conversation to the issue of taxation? And then taxation and government resources, or even public resources, are important for meeting the SDGs. So that's how I'm connected to it.
Thanks so much. So we're going to start with just a really sort of, let's lay a foundation, let's set the scene, let's set the stakes of the conversation, right? So I want to ask Wazi about, why is this so important? Why is this tax-based question so important? Particularly maybe looking at the example of Malawi. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yes, indeed, the issue of taxation is really, really important, especially for developing countries, especially for Malawi. I'll give you one practical example. For this fiscal year, the budget for the Malawi government, it's only being financed by domestic revenues, of which 90% are taxes. Only 55% of the budget is being financed by domestic revenues. But the needs of the country are huge. So where does the 45% come from? So it either has to be loans or it has to be donors supporting the other part. So this is a huge problem. And we need to see how best can we raise more revenues so that we are able to finance a big proportion of our budget. Because as you know, the donors, there's commitment and there's disbursement. The commitment maybe they give and the government would plan on those funds, but maybe it doesn't come in full. Or sometimes maybe we would have a program with donor institutions, and then the program, because of something else, ends in the middle. And then you have a problem with planned expenditures. So this becomes very important for countries such as Malawi. The health sector, for instance, financing of it, over 50% of it, it's from donors. It's not from the money that the government is generating. So indeed, there is a great need for countries to look at how they can increase revenue collection. And I think we'll go into more details, but some of the key issues relate to the illicit financial transactions, relates to tax incentives, there are so many other avenues through which revenues are not being collected, are being forgone, because there is potential for governments to collect tax revenues. The tax to GDP ratio for Malawi is at 13%, when the average for sub-Saharan Africa is at about 16.5%. And the recommendation is that we should be at least at 18% to meet the SDGs. So as you can see, the issue of taxation is very big as far as meeting the SDGs is concerned. Maybe I can stop there for now. Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to bring in Bernadette next on this point of estimating how much, where the tax to GDP ratio should be to realize the SDGs, and some of that work you've been doing with colleagues connecting tax, SDGs, and some of these outcomes that we're interested in.
Thank you, Kate. So I thought that if we had a model which realistically demonstrates or shows us the relationship between government revenue and outcomes, including SDGs, this would be a really useful tool to advocate for a change in the rules, both at the international level, but also at the domestic level. So, for example, Wazi was just discussing Malawi. So, for example, if somebody was thinking it would be a good idea to increase or decrease or change a certain tax policy, would it be helpful to know the potential impact that would have in that country? I mean, it has to be individualized to each country to be useful. So I was lucky enough to collaborate with Prof. Stephen Hawley, who at the University of Leicester. And together we developed a model using UNU-wider government revenue database and the World Governance Indicators and the SDG outcomes. And this really shows that if there's an increase in government revenue, this will have a positive impact on the SDGs, which is no surprise. What is interesting is that it's highly nonlinear, and it has a much, much larger impact in lower and low middle income countries than in high income countries. The SDG targets that we looked at was water, sanitation, and outcomes, including survival. So obviously in high income countries, most of them are at 100% in terms of water and sanitation. So an increase in revenue would have very little impact on those SDG indicators, but possibly on other indicators there'd be more of an impact. We also find that this relationship is strongly affected by a range of quality of governance indicators. And our latest work took this a step further, and we incorporated into the model the influence of an increase in government revenue on governance. So, and we all know that when governments improves, allocations decisions improve, the efficiency of public spending improves, and even economic growth improves. So our findings is that when government revenue increases, governance increases, and a virtuous circle cycle develops. So this is our latest work. So therefore, any tax gaps, for whatever reason, are critically important for SDG progress. To make this sort of practical use to people and for advocates, we have visualized this on an online tool, and I'll put the link in the chat box. And that would allow a user in an individual country to sort of take an estimation and pop it in and see what the likely benefit of that change would be. And this, could be a powerful tool for advocacy. The other thing, we've used it for cross-country studies as well. So for example, we've used the State of Tax Justice annual report to look at the impact of tax abuse across countries. And we've also used it, thinking about Kenneth and his work, we've used it to look at multinational corporations, one or two multinational corporations, and look at their positive contribution to public finances, and therefore their contribution to the SDGs. And that demonstrates that. And this all is in an effort to promote global solidarity, that we can all contribute to this goal of attaining the SDGs. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, come on in, Kenneth. I think Bernadette sort of set you up really well in raising this point about the role of corporations. And then also, I think a lot of your work also connects to this question of good governance, and what that tax, why that tax to GDP ratio is where it is. So yeah, happy for you to come in.
Is it in terms of what companies can do in relation to taxation, or in relation to the SDGs in particular?
I'm happy for you to take it in either direction. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a tension, as you can also see in the news, about multinationals, about capital flight and stuff like that. So a good number of multinationals are still drawn by the whole idea about shareholders, and they want to declare huge profits, and also the financial markets, to be fair to them, because when they don't declare this profit, the market comes against them heavily. So there's also the point to be made about the distinction that is always found in the literature, especially in international business, where people talk about home and host countries. And I think that is problematic, because if we are thinking about the SDGs, then we need also to think about it from a global perspective. And as Bernadette talked about solidarity, we are all in it together. And the SDG slogan is leave no one behind. So if we are to leave no one behind, then that dichotomy in the literature and also in practice probably needs to be challenged, because when multinationals operate abroad, they tend to see the host country sometimes from a kind of a parasitic perspective, where the idea is to extract as much as possible and then repatriate that. But sometimes not even to their home country. They go to some, tax havens and so on and so forth. But if we are to all contribute to the SDGs, then we need to find ways to finance the SDGs. And taxation is just one aspect of that. But there are other ways where companies can also use their operations and other resources they have to contribute to the SDGs. But coming back to the idea of taxation, I think there's also a problem when it comes to government, because sometimes we tend to focus more on corporations. Probably in Europe or North America, where you have strong institutions from a capitalist perspective, and the kind of politics and democracy you have, one can say, even also the technology and the data access you have. It's easy to track. So if I'm in Edinburgh and I don't pay my tax, the taxman knows how to get to me, right? And they monitor my bank transactions, or something else will trigger something that will signal to them that I've not paid my tax. But if I'm in Nigeria, the system might not be well connected. And even if you have to identify that I've not paid tax, where will you find me? Will you come to my village, or will you come to the urban area? So that complexity in itself makes it quite difficult for government. But the other thing also is where governments are continuously pushing on companies and individuals in a very aggressive manner to extract tax, but without the commensurate accountability and transparency, which in itself can be problematic. Maybe something we can touch upon at some point in time. but I think I see a good relationship between transparency, accountability, and compliance, where people pay tax and see it more as a civil duty, as opposed to one that they see it as a form of extortion. And that extortion then makes it more as a game, whereby the individual, the companies try as much as possible to save as much as they can from the claws of the government. And the government, on the other hand, sets all sorts of traps to get more from individuals and companies. And if it's set like that as a game, society, I will argue, loses ultimately, because that kind of game induces all sort of creativity. And I remember someone saying that there are two professional groups that you don't want to be creative. One is the lawyers, and the other one is the accountant. So I want to become creative. It becomes quite dangerous for society.
Let's bring Wazi in on this point about, Kenneth has set up this idea of this, well, both there's a relationship, there's almost an exchange. If you're going to ask tax of us as a corporation, what do corporations ask of the state? And this sort of antagonistic relationship. I'd be really curious to hear about your reflections from the tax side and from the Ministry of Finance side.
No, thank you very much. I totally agree. There's that linkage that, the corporations who expect something in exchange when they're paying these taxes. But are they paying their fair share for a start? And then how do we make sure that the corporations are paying the proper amount of taxes? And I think on their own, left on their own, maybe they will not. So what as governments can do to ensure that maybe corporations are being tax compliant? And I think there are a number of them, especially for developing countries. We need to look at tax reform and how developing countries can support domestic revenue mobilization initiatives to reform the tax, especially on automation. Kenneth was saying, I can sit in my office and whatever transaction I know, the taxman is able to know. We don't have this in Africa, in most of these developing countries, like in Malawi. A person would sell an asset, a big asset, maybe a commercial property, but the taxman has no idea that this transaction has gone through. Why is that? It's because we don't have proper systems in place to trace these transactions. So I think support for tax reform is one key area, but also tax treaties. I think the work that the UN does, reviewing tax treaties, ensuring that they are beneficial to low-income countries is very key. And I think we need to do a bit more work on that, even if it means reviewing some of the tax treaties that countries have with other countries, double tax agreements. We need to review that. But I think that also the global level, the country-by-country reporting is a very good initiative. We have to know what incomes are being generated by national corporations and from where. And that will increase that transparency for better taxations. I think those are some of the three initiatives that I can quickly think are very important to ensure that companies or corporations are paying their fair share. But the expenditure aspect is also a good angle that countries as well need to ensure that they are undertaking, providing infrastructure, utilities, electricity, making sure that there is a good environment for companies to thrive. Thank you.
Yeah, as a political scientist, hearing Kenneth talk, I think of infrastructural power. This idea that it's not just coercive power that you can hit someone on the head, but this idea that the infrastructure of the state, the ability to perceive and spread power through knowledge, through or what Foucault would call knowledge power, is incredibly important. And a lot of what we talk about at IIPP is with digitalization, with more online transactions, how does that change, infrastructural power, particularly in states where that power hasn't been as developed. There's really, you see that, happening in India as they move more into online transactions around welfare payments and things like that. So there's some really interesting themes that connect much more broadly. I see we've got a question in the chat, which I thought I would just bring in now because it connects very much to what Wazi was just saying, and it's around BEPS, which has been a big discussion over the last sort of 5-10 years. So base erosion and profit shifting. So yeah, I'd be happy for any of you guys to pick up, talk a little bit about BEPS and how we deal with MNCs, multinational corporations. And we're in a very interesting space with that over the last just few years in a corporate minimum tax. But yeah, I'm happy for anyone to come in on the BEPS question.
Yeah, I'm happy to go, but I can also, see what colleagues say because we think I'm pro-business, right? Yeah, businesses are there to maximize their interests, no matter how much or how we look at it, right? So, and as Wazi said, if you leave them at their own device, maybe they may not want to pay. Nobody wants to pay tax. Except for the Scandinavians. Sometimes they say, oh, we love paying tax, right? But most people in the world don't love to pay tax. So the more, if they can minimize their tax, they will do that. But I also think that they're able to do so, especially where they think there is no link between the tax they pay and the impact they are not paying tax will have. So there's that kind of mental decoupling between the action and the impact. And if they're not feeling the impact, then they will move their taxes to wherever and take advantage of that. And there's also the tendency that you can treat it as an externality, right? And one of the problems with the way the market is organized or the market is taught to operate is the fact that you assume there are some assumptions, basic assumptions behind capitalism. One is that you have a strong government, you have a strong civil society, and then within that, then companies can do whatever they like, in quote, as long as they play within the rules of the game. And so companies pursue their individual interests, hoping that either the government or the civil society will pick up those negative externalities and address them. But when you come into the most developing countries, where the governments are not as strong and also sometimes the civil society is missing, then it becomes quite difficult because what is happening here is that companies are thinking through what we call the global norms of doing business. And the global norms are coming from your global north, so to speak, in quote. And they transfer those and say, this is how business is done. This is the business of business is business. But that collapse, that argument doesn't work in contexts that are not similar to your global north. So sometimes they act innocently, in quotes, because they assume that the contexts are similar. And that process in itself then shortchanges their host communities or where they do business. But that's not excusing them in any way, because there's also an incentive to pay a tax. There's also an incentive to have good infrastructure. Even from an enlightened self-interest perspective, poverty is no good for business. So if you want the communities where you're doing business, if you want to extract more in terms of revenue, it's in your own interest to ensure that their purchasing power is up. If you want to reduce the cost of doing business, so it's also good to ensure that they have good infrastructure, good logistics, good power base. And they can't do all these things without tax, right? So if you don't have that long-term view, unless you're more like a short-term investor and you're willing to make money and run, then it's in your interest in the long run to make sure that the societies in which you do business are also profitable, are also viable to enable your business to thrive. Only short-term investors would probably do the kind of things we have articulated here. But if you look at companies that have been there for a long time, they tend to have a much more benign approach. But it doesn't mean that sometimes they are not forced into these kind of dodgy practices.
Yeah, and it gets you into situations of very weak states where companies end up playing state-like functions. And then they're building their own infrastructure, they're building their own water and sanitation, they're educating and flying people around. And then that really is part of this whole discussion of hollowing out the state, where their connection or their need to have that relationship with the state in order to function properly has completely broken.
Just to add quickly also is that the multinationals have grown. When we thought about business or entrepreneurs, they were small. But today you have multinationals that are richer than some countries. So they also have power. But it also challenges the assumption that society should be governed by government or the state. I think we take that for granted, so we always want the state to be there. But what if we are changing into a situation whereby the state is no longer the sole guarantor of civil rights and responsibility? What role can businesses play? And as much as we might be terrified by that idea of businesses having more power, but it might be a natural evolution in ways things are governed. And if you think back in time, there was a time that the state didn't exist. I'm not a political scientist, but we can trace the origin of the state and the importance of the state and how the state has come to be as dominant as it is today. But what if the state is fading? What if another thing is coming out? What either to supplant the state or complement it? I think we should be open to those kind of possibilities.
Absolutely. I'll pass on to others because I'm responding too much to Kenneth, but one of the papers that we teach in the course links, the origin of the state to taxes and to having to reach out to people to levy taxes. That builds up a relationship with the state. You build again this infrastructural power. But in cases where there's natural resource dominance or a colonial economy, you don't have that relationship forming between people and the state. And so, it's a really wonderful paper looking at Latin America and really saying, how these tax structures have formed is different in the global north and the global south, is different in colonial countries to European colonial countries. And, showing that has this legacy for infrastructure, state power, and how states are able to interact with citizens. So there are these long consequences of things about, how tax bases are formed. I did want to, before I want to shift a little bit to talk more about that question of colonialism. But Bernadette, in our prior conversation, you had raised this question about how there's a growing discourse of companies paying tax as a form of CSR or corporate social responsibility. And I'd be interested in you if you'd reflect a little bit on that comment and that observation.
Thanks, Kit. Yes, CSR activities are discretionary, whereas tax is not discretionary. And I think the last time we talked, we discussed, increasingly companies are asking companies to discuss CSR, to discuss tax payment within the context of CSR. And I suppose my problem with this, and I'm just listening very carefully to what Kenneth just said, which is fascinating. My problem with this would be, is it the company's decision to redistribute wealth, or is it the government? Who is the best person to do that in any given country? Would a company know enough about a country to know where the greatest needs are, where the inequality is the greatest? So that would be my concern about regarding tax under the CSR umbrella. Simply because the government knows much more about their own country, they know their strategy, they know, whereas the strategies of the CSR may be to benefit their own profit because it's seen as a good thing to do. It may be for other reasons, to disguise wrongdoings, but that would be my concern with regarding tax as a CSR issue.
Yeah. Very nice. And Wazi, do you want to come in on this sort of role of discretion, strong state?
Yeah. No, thank you. I think I totally agree with Bernadette. The CSR, it's really not compulsory, and the allocation of resources, if you leave it to corporations, it would be difficult because some of the investments that government do are quite huge. So who would undertake those investments if you leave them to companies? Would the companies form some form of organization to be funding it if they want to build a road or some huge infrastructure? So I think the issue, we leave CSR as CSR and maybe still concentrate on the tax and making sure that we have a government. And I think it is for generally, for the most part, government does a good job, I think, in distributing wealth and, you know, creating the good environment for everyone. Thank you.
So I wanted to go back to this discussion of difference between global North, global South, strong, weak states, colonial and colonized, because in our initial discussion, this came up as, you know, are some of the issues around tax compliance, around participation in tax, and also around institutional strength in post-colonial countries, is this a legacy, or is this partially being driven by that status? So is the fact that these are viewed potentially, or tax is viewed as potentially as something that came from the colonial tradition, is this actually a barrier or a concern, which is something that Kenneth raised, I think was a really interesting point to build on. And then also, are there alternatives that exist that can be drawn on to increase participation in tax, or to help people rethink the relationship of tax, state, and their role? So yeah, Kenneth, I'm happy for you to come in, because this was really your brainchild, but really curious about others' thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kate. I think the point that government, they know, I think there's an assumption, not an assumption, but a point Bernadette made, and as well as the government knows, therefore the state in a better position to redistribute and things like that. I think it's a part of the problem of romanticization of the state, because we also know that the state or the government is driven by interest. You know, politicians have their interest, they come on board, so they are not completely pro people in quote. And it comes back to the idea of colonization here. If you think about the state or government in Africa in particular, I wouldn't ascribe this notion of knowing or knowledge to the state and the state being efficient as one would anticipate it to be. So, which is also part of the problem, because even the idea of the state in itself is a colonial artifact. A colonial technology, so to speak, that Africans have inherited. So there's that big gap between the people and the state. And Peter Eke articulated it very well when he talked about the two publics. So you have the formal sector in quote, where government and state operations occur, and then you have the informal in quote, because it's outside the purview of the colonial form of governance. And if you look at taxation too, taxation can come into that mix, so that people see taxation as a way of being extorted by some political elites, in this case, the government. Whereas in traditional settings, people have had ways of solving communal or community problems by taxing themselves in other ways. And those forms of taxes will have high compliance, and they also can see what they are used for. So in that case, there is clear accountability and transparency, and people can see the projects, and the projects are nearer to them. And the funny bit of it, I don't know about other African countries, but I think in Nigeria, the tax law doesn't expect anything from the government. So the tax law says you have to pay a tax, but there's nothing in the tax law that says the government should do X for the people. So I don't, again, know whether it's specific to Nigerian law or an inheritance from the British legal system. So I don't know how it is in Malawi. So in that case, people lose the ability to hold the government accountable for anything, because the law says pay a tax, but don't bother about whether the government does anything with it or not. That for me is a false accountability that runs contrary to the traditional or indigenous ways of relating with either kings or traditional rulers, because you do something, you expect something in return. So I think our understanding of taxation and the failure of taxation can be further appreciated from that perspective. And then the last point I want to make is, if the literature has said that compliance, transparency and accountability enhance compliance, voluntary compliance, why are African governments terrified by transparency and accountability? And maybe Wazi can speak to that at some point.
Wazi, you've been called. I'm happy to respond too, but yeah, please come in.
Okay, no, thank you very much. The question of why do people comply? Why do people pay tax? Or not avoid paying taxes? It's quite broad. And literally, almost any reason you can think of, you might put it there. Because the literature, when you look at this question in the literature, there are so many reasons. Yes, there is the aspect of transparency. If there is transparent, maybe you get, there's compliance. But maybe even there's that exchange to say if you're providing services, then there's compliance. If the people trust the government or the political party in ruling, there's compliance. So it's difficult to really, I think there are so many other factors that we need to look at to arrive at this compliance, not just one. And this is where the problem is. Maybe we might not have transparency, but is it the transparency that is limiting tax compliance, or there are other factors? Because really, the literature is so broad. But I agree with Kenneth on that. Maybe government is not the best to distributing wealth and things like that. But what other better option do we have other than the government to be doing that for now? I guess that would be my question. And on colonial heritage, to say most of this, maybe it's because it's inherited for countries like Africa. Yes, there is a good literature, and I think Tandika Kandawi Malawian as well wrote on tax effort and colonial heritage in Africa. It's quite good making these linkages between tax and how African countries operate in terms of tax. So there's that legacy issue, and that might be maybe bringing in difficulties in terms of taxation. But I think unless we have a better system, for now, the government, I think it's a better option. But I would really be happy to see properly put down by Kenneth this idea that is putting out. I would be interested indeed. For now, I'll stick with the government. Thank you.
I did want to come in on, again, with the political scientist hat on, some of what I'm hearing is a discussion of a legitimacy crisis. So, are these institutions legitimate? And if they're extractive institutions or taxes, are they the right ones? Is it appropriate? And, Wazi is saying this is a really vast literature about why people pay taxes, but there sort of breaks into two big camps. So there's a sense of you're concerned about getting caught, you're concerned about getting in trouble, right? Fine, that's very normal motivation for people. But then the other side is the sort of logic of appropriateness. It's the right things to do. My parents paid tax, now I pay tax, and my kids will pay tax. It's sort of so normalized and part of your world. And that is really what we would consider sort of the deepest, if we think about someone like a scholar, Mark Suchman, he thinks that the most legitimate institutions are those that you don't even think about. Of course I pay tax at the end of the year. Of course it comes out of my pay. It's just so normalized. But when you're in situations where legitimacy is contested or is much weaker, then it's tricky, right? And that's where things like performance, if an entity performs well, that becomes a source of legitimacy. Which, again, to connect to Bernadette's earlier point, if states aren't raising revenue and are performing poorly, that further erodes one of their sources of legitimacy. So in some of these contexts, you're talking about states that have a legitimacy problem because of the colonial origins, because of colonial boundaries, because of all the mess that, and violence and horror created through that system. And then they've also have the double side where then this way of regaining legitimacy through effectiveness is being undermined because they don't have the revenues to do that. So you're not saying, okay, I'm going to pay tax because my kid's going to school and that's working well. You're saying, well, I'm schooling my kid at home, or I'm paying through my church, and that's how this child is. So the state is becoming less relevant. So it's a really tricky problem with lots of potentially problematic feedback loops. So really, really interesting observations there. I want to raise, I'm seeing the questions come in, and rather than sort of stopping for questions, I thought I'd just raise another one. and this is a question from Mark Bassett, who's a member of IIPP and one of our fantastic MPAs. He was asking about what do the panelists think are some of the most powerful methods in low and middle income countries to incentivize and reward governments, companies, and individuals for timely transparency. How do we incentivize transparency? I'm happy for anyone to jump in on that.
Yeah, maybe I can start. I think at it would have to be maybe a push at the global level to have these initiatives where we're encouraging transparency, the country by country reporting. Have an agreement at that level to say countries have to be reporting in terms of taxes or agreements and things like that. If it's agreed at that level, and countries are committed signing some documents to say we'll be doing this, that is one way of encouraging it, I would say.
Yeah, I think from the corporate side of things, it can also be, one can create incentives. So how do we reward companies that come forward to show that they've done their tax? And that can also come from consumers, right? So because sometimes we are looking towards government. When we go to shop, do we consider whether these companies pay their taxes or not? So, without naming names, Apple is a great brand. And we always queue up to buy the latest Apple products. But when we do that, do we also check the tax profile of Apple or any other big brand? So beyond the government, so I think both investors as well, consumers can incentivize or reward companies. From the side of government, I think it will be also in their own interest if they show transparency, because they can win them votes, especially where you also think that votes count in low and middle income countries, as we mentioned. It might be a tough one because corruption is the other thing that stands in the way of transparency. So, and if I'm corrupt, that means I need more money for my campaigns, and if I need money for elections, then it's kind of a dangerous circle there, because you need to steal the money to give to the people or to buy their votes one way or the other. And if you buy their vote, they lose the legitimacy to hold you to account. So that in itself is problematic. But if governments can be bold enough to change that trend by showcasing what they do through the money they collect, and then people might see those and vote for them. So in that sense, I think companies on one hand can be incentivized through consumers or investors, and then voters can incentivize government to do the right thing.
And one of the things we dealt with in this project with the Pescairis in Spain was, how do you use taxes to incentivize different behaviors within firms? We were looking at particularly towards the SDGs, so using incentives and potentially credits, and in a way that we already see tax used for things like discouraging smoking, or there's a lot of interest in carbon tax. Or green innovation, right? How do we use tax to push actors in a positive green SDG direction? I want to ask a question that I haven't previewed with the panelists, so I apologize that I'm springing this on you. But I wanted to go. We've been talking a lot about the tax side of this discussion, but I wanted to bring it back to the SDG side. And one of the things that makes the SDGs so powerful is that they're considered to be universal, undisputed. We sometimes sort of joke they're seen like the 10 commandments, the 17 commandments brought down, sort of perfectly formed. But as academics, as scholars, we say, actually, these have a history, these have a politics. It matters who was in the room when they were created. Some things like language and culture or LGBTQI rights aren't in there, where other things are in. So if we think of these as political and as having an origin, does that change this conversation? Or also, are the SDGs even the right tool? Are they the right set of targets that we should be talking about? And why are we not? And Bernadette, I'm going to bring you in on this. Are the SDGs the right thing to be focusing on, or are they the best we've got? What are your sort of views on the use of the framework?
Well, the SDGs, like all goals, are optional. There's no sanctions. So you can have goals, but you don't have to reach them. And that is the bottom line with goals. Whereas human rights brings with it duty and obligations and duty bearers and responsibility. So that's one side of it. But on the other side, the SDGs are grounded in the international human rights law. And my reason for framing things with respect to the SDGs is because it's a language that a lot of people understand at the moment. Whereas if you start to talk about human rights, it gets a bit more difficult. So I see SDG progress and increased access to human rights as interchangeable. But I think that's the important difference between human rights and goals, is there isn't any duty bearer with regards to goals. So if a company avoids tax and people don't have access to their fundamental rights, the SDG target in that country may not be reached, so what? But if a company avoids tax and people don't have access to their rights and people die, then that's a problem. Or if a higher income country remains passive while companies headquartered in their territory are avoiding fair and transparent tax in other countries, then that's their responsibility within international human rights law. So that's what I would say is the difference, but nonetheless, then they're extremely useful. And the fantastic thing about them is they're so all-encompassing, because there's no point talking about, as I mentioned when I introduced it, talking about healthcare facilities when really health might depend on other determinants of health, which happens far away from the facility. So they're very useful from that perspective.
And you've spoken a little bit about efforts to align tax and human rights. I don't know if you want to expand on that now, or you'll talk about that later.
Yeah, well, I suppose just going back to that point, if a higher income country remains passive when companies headquartered on their territory avoids paying taxes in low income countries, then they are responsible for those, indirectly responsible for people overseas not having access to their human rights because of this practice. So, and there's been lots of comments and commentaries from experts, international experts, from UN committees on reviews of individual countries to say that they are responsible, they should review their policies, they should think about them, look at the impact they're having overseas. And it does have some influence when it's couched like that. And there's a particular onus on those countries which some more than others create the vulnerabilities, which allows countries to lose so much government revenue from tax. And they are, really are particularly they should be under the pressure to review their policies. And then if you look at it through the frame of policy coherence for development, it makes absolutely no sense to give aid on one hand, while at the same time remaining passive, while companies headquartered in your territory avoid tax in that same country. So there's lots of ways to look at it, but it all comes back to the same thing. It makes sense first to do no harm before trying to do good,
Very much coming from your medical ethics, yeah.
The Hippocratic Oath had to come out there.
for everything, yeah, absolutely. So, Wazi or Kenneth, do you have thoughts on this question of, is the SDG, are the SDGs the right framework? Are they relevant, or are they just convenient? What is your sense about the role of the SDGs and sort of the politics of the SDGs at this moment?
Yeah, for me, I think the SDGs are imperfect, but they're also a good starting point. At least we have something we can use as a global language, so to speak, as Bernadette has mentioned. But it also has its own problems, complexities. And when it comes to the different goals, there is an assumption that they're all equal. Right? I mean, but what if they're in competition? So some people ask questions about poverty and the environment, go 1 or go 10 or go 9, whatever it is. And if you're caught in between health and education, and so what do you do? And also see companies themselves who are trapped in that, countries as well. But there's also the problem here, which I see coming from the global north. Once you mention sustainability or the SDGs, people think about climate change. And that in itself is some kind of climate change imperialism. And it's driving finance now. It's driving financial flows. So for projects in the global south to receive funding, especially from the global north, they have been asked to comply to some of this green initiative or green issues. I'm not saying that the green issues are not important, but when you're in the global south, there are things that are more pressing than the environment. And if you also look at the contribution of the global south to the global climate crisis, it's very minimal. So if you exclude India, to an extent China, the rest, I mean, Africa, look at what Africa is contributing to it. But today, Africa is being kind of dragged by the nose, but whereas Africa has other problems like poverty, health, education, and so on and so forth. But I can also understand the argument that climate can connect to health problems, can connect to economic challenges, or so on and so forth. But I would think that in many African countries, they should have the leeway to centralize some of the SDGs and use them to drive their own conversation. So everything shouldn't be driven from that lens of climate change. If I put poverty at the heart of it or education at the heart of it, I can still get to climate change at some point. I think that needs to be recognized in the way things are currently done and perceived.
There are you raise a whole bunch of really important themes. So first on that idea of interaction and these negative interactions between SDGs. And when I've had conversations about what comes next, right? We're halfway through the 2030 agenda, give or take, and so there's already work starting on, what comes after the SDGs. And one sort of critical development studies read on the SDGs is the UN had a identity crisis post-Cold War and needed a new way to think about aid and think about this. And so the MDGs around the millennium and then the SDGs. So there's a lot of impetus and energy towards keeping this type of vision of the agenda going. But the idea that the next round, that interactions, thinking about how they work together will be much more of the focus, because that's been part of the challenge or blind spot with the current. And then the other item that you meant, Kenneth, that I think ties to really key themes or key discussions about the SDGs is this question of localization. So, what do the SDGs mean in South Africa versus Bangladesh versus the UK? And, when we were doing this work in Spain, the issue in that region, in the Biscay region, was obesity and aging. And you open up the SDGs, you can download it as a spreadsheet with all the targets and indicators, and you type in aging, you type in any kind of synonym, and nothing comes up, right? And so, it's built for this very general audience, potentially more with a view of the global South. And so there's these blind spots or omissions, for things like an aging population. So localization has become a big conversation. How do you take this framework and make it relevant to Nigeria and its large petroleum sector? How do you make it relevant to Spain and aging and concerns around labor? You do hit a point, the sort of tipping point. At what point are the SDGs no longer the SDGs? if you've changed so much to make it fit. So there's the localization piece isn't as simple maybe as it can look from the outside. But yeah, very, very nice points. Wazi, speaking from the government perspective, I'm curious about your thoughts on the SDGs as a framework and how you see it being mobilized politically or not.
Yeah, okay. No, thank you. I totally agree with you, Kate, and what Kenneth said. Countries are at different of development. And in that case, the needs of the countries are also different. So the SDGs, when you look at these different goals, the focus of a country might be more into towards one of the goals. Say maybe for a country like Malawi will be focused more on maybe on poverty eradication and not the other goals. So some of them indeed might be competing because maybe if we focus on climate change aspects, then maybe we might do little or we might not have funds to do the other aspects. So there's that competition in some of the goals, or maybe a trade-off, maybe not a competition in some of the goals. So that maybe is a kind of a limitation, and maybe that's where the talk of localization comes in, which makes sense. But overall, in general, I think it's a good tool to have because governments are shaped by this. They're kind of pushed to say, you know what, we have this goal. On poverty, we want to get here, so it's good to have something to measure yourselves against, to say this is where we want to be. And countries really do kind of push because everyone will know where you are, and it's because of that countries try to push to get done most of these goals or to achieve most of these goals. So because they know everyone is watching us, everyone will see this. So as a tool of pushing governments to do the right things, to an extent, I think they are very good. But yeah, some of the goals, there are those limitations. Otherwise, overall, I support them. Thank you.
Yeah, the peer pressure, the reporting, the disclosure side is absolutely sort of as soft international law, where like Bernadette said, you're not going to have enforcement mechanisms tied in. These effects of benchmarking, reporting are all really key to it. So I'm just going to check questions. We had sort of a question from Peter that I thought was interesting to bring in. And he's talking about, what about the introduction of a digital currency? I'm going to change the question a little bit. He talks about, what does the panel think of creating a digital currency for a country that is owned by its citizens, and using that currency to drive market demand as citizens for public services and consumers in industry? I think I'm happy for you to take on the specific question, which you should be able to see in the Q&A box, but also maybe use it to reflect more broadly on digital currency, digitalization, and some of the implications for potentially SDGs. We know things like crypto has a huge carbon footprint, but also for taxation. Has cryptocurrency, have digital currencies affected how we're thinking about tax currently, and maybe how we should be thinking down the road? Maybe, Wazi, if you don't mind starting there, because this has a real sort of enforcement and implementation side to it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. The digital currency one, I think for most developing countries, the digital market, the digital currency hasn't picked up quite much. And I think government would be resisting to go into this area, only because they quite don't just understand it quite well to say its implication on various aspects, even taxation. So there would be, I would think, resistance. We would want to see it maybe if developing countries are starting something like this, and then because they have better, internet automation and things like that, online things, unlike developed countries. So my take for now, I would say most developing countries would want to wait first than creating a digital currency for now. That's what I would say. Thanks.
And what about the enforcement issues around things like cryptocurrency? Is that something that's being talked about in Malawi, in your ministries, or is that sort of not on the radar screen so much?
No, not really. It's not being talked much. Yeah, not in Malawi at least.
Yeah, it's been anti-money laundering. There's been a lot of discussion about the role of crypto there, and some of the visibility by the state into these transactions. And I think tax will probably be taking part in that conversation if it's not already happening. Bernadette or Kenneth, do you want to come in on this question of digital currency or reflect more broadly on that?
When it comes to, I'm not an expert on digital currency. I must raise my hand here. And the way it was framed, I was thinking that currency that is owned by the country. I mean, what do central banks do? They're custodians of the country's currency. But again, it maybe points to some kind of common ownership. And if it's about common ownership, there is also a drawback there because people may not be as motivating as people having their own thing. That for me will be some kind of drawback there. And then how do we ensure fairness in the system? Who is contributing to what? I think there was another question that was talking about people coming from wealthy homes and kind of in different category of people who relate to tax in different ways. But I think one of the critical things when it comes to tax policies and what you want to achieve is fairness. And you find some countries who tend to penalize successful people because of what they do, what they produce. Well, you can argue that they can't produce what they produce without the institutional enablers. But at the same time, also, you want to be careful that there is a good balance between what we get from them and their ability to produce. That's why sometimes they leave a certain country and move elsewhere. The same also applies to multinationals. How do you draw that balance? Because it appears that there is a kind of a public either anger or even envy that is associated with, or that is attributed to people who create wealth. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but at the same time, that balance needs to be achieved or attained. But the key point there for me is fairness. How do you ensure that you're fair to the person who make the money and also to people or the institutions that enable the individual to succeed? I think that also will apply to the digital currency if one was to adopt that in terms of who does what and how do we ensure that we're all putting our weight without any free riders.
Yeah, Bernadette.
I don't know if this is exactly answering Peter's question. And I mean, I don't know if it matters if the currency is digital or not, but I think the idea of public money creation for social good is a wonderful idea, particularly if it is to avoid overseas debt, for example. So I don't know if that's exactly what Peter is thinking about when he talks about a digital currency. Could a government in a lower, and I've often asked this questions of economists, why don't governments in lower income countries essentially print some money to drive their own development? I only ever get one word answer, and it's always hyperinflation, That's the end of that conversation. But I mean, we've seen QE during COVID and in 2008, and I don't know if that's an argument anymore. So that would be I think they should, whether or not it's digital, I don't think it matters.
Wazi, do you want to come in on that, or yeah, okay. I think these discussions of fairness and the idea of global, all of this does connect to the fact that there's coordination issues in international tax policy, and I think the rise of digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, all of that is going to just increase that challenge, and the fact this is the ES, the based erosion and profit, the PS and profit shifting. So moving to more favorable tax, tax countries or tax havens. That's what coordination. This is a classic coordination problem where Ireland has an incentive to underbid others to draw business towards them. Christos made that comment in the questions. And so, it really has to be coordinated, and there can't be defectors in order to at least create a base and reduce some of this game playing. I wanted to pick up one other aspect of Christos's question. He talked about, how can the SDGs be a prerequisite or a conditionality for sustainable investments in a supranational level? And I want to take on that question from maybe a slightly different perspective. And how do we know how companies are performing against the SDGs? Because anytime we're going to tie incentives or disincentives to corporate performance, the first thing that we need to understand is disclosure, reporting, measurement, and are we doing it right? And that became, I've mentioned a couple times the work that IIPP did in the Biscay region of Spain, where they were looking at tying tax incentives or favorable tax treatment to SDG performance. It really became a project about measurement. How do we know how well companies are doing? How do we add this up in a way that makes sense? And more broadly, when you're working with a framework like the SDGs, which can look simple on the outside with 17 goals, but has 232 indicators with it, how do you translate that into something that's reportable? And so we did a lot of work on that, but it also has raised lots of questions about can there be global reporting standards? So GRI has become a player at the forefront of this. And then also back to this north-south localization question, can you have a single set of standards? Is that appropriate when you're trying to do this? So just sort of raising the question of using the SDGs as a tool or as a filter, immediately you get into reporting, disclosure, and measurement questions, which are really, really tricky. We've got not too much time left, but I wanted to have anyone come in on this. And maybe, Bernadette, I'm interested in some of the measurement work that your projects have looked at and how you've approached some of these questions.
Yeah, so I think the easiest, well, I would think the way we should measure it is the way I measure it, which is just through do companies pay their tax and what is the impact of that within a given country? And I think that's how companies should measure what they do. If we try and measure it using all of the other SDGs, I think it's going to be very woolly, and sometimes companies could be accused of sort of greenwashing or SDG washing or whatever. And there'd be an awful lot of money and effort spent on trying to make some things look good when we could actually do something real. So that's what I would say is we could actually make a massive difference. Companies do make a massive difference if they all started to report it in a transparent and publicly available way. We'd see what a huge contribution they're making, and that's how I would approach this. So
this sort of argument for a single indicator has become quite interesting. So you're saying, let's just look at their contribution to the state, contribution to tax. Mm-hmm. Let's not care about the industry sector, anything that they're in. There's an argument made by Richard Barker at Oxford, and he says, let's throw everything out and just look at carbon. That should be the only thing we care about. And then I see Kenneth going, no way. We're not just going to look at carbon. We're not just going to boil the SDGs down to SDG 13 or even one aspect of SDG 13. But Kenneth, come on in here.
Yeah, I think I like the point Bernadette made, but I think one thing also to bear in mind is that sometimes paying your tax or your fines may not be sufficient. I give you a classic example. In Nigeria, it's cheaper to flare gas and pay tax or pay the fine, right? So, and the company can say, I've paid, you want it to be X amount of dollars, I've paid that. So, and it's more expensive to invest in the appropriate technology to reduce gas flaring. So I think we also need to make a distinction between what I may call the core activities of the firm and the peripheral. So if a company starts, a company creates jobs, so that can fit into goal 8, about decent job and so on and so forth. And there are also the other things that companies can do in terms, every company satisfies some needs, if you put it that way. If they don't satisfy any needs, they will be out of business. So those needs they satisfy, to what extent can they also qualify as the SDGs? So it makes it a bit convoluted. There's also what I may call the selective versus the holistic. So there are 17 goals. Some companies are beginning to prioritize, so we can't do the 17 of them. Let's focus on 1 or 2 or 3 because it gives them the sort of focus. But if they're focused on the 3 or 4 and they're causing other problems along the line, to what extent should we hold them to account because they are not doing everything? There is also the tension between what I may call the corporate level reporting and the national level reporting. So the SDGs are driven more from the national. So the countries are expected to report. But there is an assumption here that if companies do things, they will automatically trickle up or become a kind of bottom-up approach where what companies do will eventually translate to national report. But we see that that connection is not there. I do a lot of work with companies. Companies, they produce a report, whether it's GRI or whatever. But if you look at those things, they don't tell you how they connect to national performance standards. And the national performance standard also is not linked to the global. So some of the people are now talking about science-based targeting or something like that. And even the idea of planetary boundaries, using them as ways to measure. So few companies are able to track, say, the impact on water or air quality to kind of the planetary boundaries, and it's quite difficult to do. So these are some of the challenges involved in doing that. And then also the last point I want to make on this is the tension between the local and the global. If you're a multinational firm, do you report on what you do in Indonesia, or do you report on what you do in the US? How do you harmonize these things and create a common narrative, which becomes quite convoluted?
And just coming in on that, Kenneth, do you have any concerns about companies with, absolutely no expertise in a given area contributing to a country, totally outside there, an oil company, for example, specializing in SDG 4 or whatever? How do you think about that? What's your thoughts on that?
Companies, many companies will focus on what they call material impacts, they have materiality. So that's one of the concepts they use there. So if a company has a material impact on the environment and then leaves it and focuses on something else, then the measurement system at the moment, the GRI, you're likely to find that company out. Then the other thing is also to focus on things that are material to society, but not material to the business, right? So how do you then balance that? So in terms of expertise, I think few companies would want to dabble into what they don't understand. They are likely to outsource those functions if they think they are critical. But where they don't understand it and dabbling into it, it's a higher risk, if you ask me. And a few of them will do that. But if they go into it, then they are asking for more troubles, isn't it?
Although the way I interpreted Bernadette's question was, what we see a lot, or at least we saw sort of in classic CSR. So where a company is doing X, they're selling low quality food, and then they're saying, oh, we're going to invest in reforestation. We're going to do something. So, sometimes having activity in an area completely disconnected to the core business is a strategy in of itself.
Greenwashing is there. Companies can manipulate these things. So it's about, companies can also tell stories and do also to enhance their profit, and even also to distract from their core impact. And there's a problem of information asymmetry. Going back to the case of the Niger Delta in Nigeria. So a company can go to the local community and say, what do you want? Water or school? And they say it's water, but the same company is destroying livelihoods, right? So, but the people don't know that there's a link between what companies are doing and the basics upon which they live. So, but information asymmetry that becomes a major problem. So it can also apply to other forms of corporate activities. So I completely agree that can also be part of the problem.
Yeah, we go back to Candide, tend your garden. So, don't tell us that you're planting trees if you're not paying a living wage, or, this kind of thing. Okay, I'll stop editorializing. We're coming to the end of our time. It's gone so fast. And I wanted to end with a question to each of the panelists. So, or I'm going to ask two questions, and you can choose which you want to go with. So the first is, what's a key recommendation, a key takeaway for people who are listening? And it seems like a mix of scholars and practitioners on this webinar. And then also, or alternatively, what's something that people get wrong often about this issue that you really think they should, remind them or set them right? So either a key recommendation or something you say, people often misunderstand this point. I want to make sure you leave this webinar understanding this or getting this right. So Wazi, I'm going to put you in the hot seat and start with you first, if that's okay. I think Wazi might be frozen. So well, or at least he's frozen on my screen. So Bernadette, oh, here we are.
Okay. No, thank you very much. For me, the SDG. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine. You've just come back.
You can hear me. The question on tax and the SDGs. And for yes, and for me, I think the biggest, most low-income countries, it will be difficult to achieve the SDGs, and there's need for support in terms of domestic revenue mobilization. And for that, I'll go back to the key areas that I looked at. One, on tax reform. Two, tax treaties imbalances, removing those. And three, the transparency, the country-by-country reporting. These three things, I think, if at the country level, at the global level, we need to take key initiatives to ensure that they are being done collectively. Thank you.
And let's go Kenneth next.
Yeah, building on that, and I would say from the government side of things, especially governments in Africa, I would say be more transparent and accountable. It's that's one way to grow tax compliance. Studies have shown that, and I can also point to my recent study that spoke about that. Then the other thing is for companies, they should also try to hold government to account. So it's not the government that holds the company's account, especially the powerful ones. But I can also understand the political risk involved if you speak up or speak out against what the government is doing. But accountability is critical, and both government and companies can make that work. If we're able to achieve that, then we can see an increase in tax revenue, and then also good use of tax for public services.
Thank you. And Bernadette.
Sorry, Kate, I couldn't get my mute. So I suppose I think of it from a higher income country perspective. And if we think about it, I mean, we need action at the global level. I think Waziri mentioned that earlier on. We need action at national levels, and at subnational, we need action in public bodies, multinational corporations, and then finally down, and I think Kenneth had mentioned earlier on, even individual level, whether or not you make a decision to buy a given phone. And I think at the global level, I really think we need a body which will sort of represent all countries, placed to sort of democratically reflect their needs in terms of tax, sharing information, monitoring tax across countries. And I suppose different recommendations have come out over the last couple of years, starting with the Mbeki report in 2015 and leading on, other sort of the African groups, the United Nations and the G77. There's been other recommendations along this sort of strand or mode of thinking that we need a global body to help us sort of navigate through these difficult pathways. And that would result in all of the good things that we all want, which was achievement of the SDGs in all countries. It would really, really help. At the national level, and as I say, I'm thinking in terms of higher income countries, I think they need to be very careful that there's nothing their country is doing which compromises other countries. And that means a review of their policies from the perspective of policy coherence for development, from the perspective of international human rights law, but they should be reviewing their policies, particularly those countries, as I mentioned, that are more responsible than other countries for this problem. And they should be, using the usual, automatic exchange of information, beneficial ownership, and ensuring all they comply with country by country regulations. So I think that's something they could be doing, which would really help. And then we come down to public bodies, and I think it was mentioned earlier, but just to say, public bodies really should not spend public money without first making sure they're aligned with the SDGs. And this would fall under that. And then multinational corporations, I think we've discussed quite a lot. And at the individual level is to support all of those things above and to to advocate, to vote, to consume and bank, align with the SDGs or aligned with their own principles would be my recommendations.
Thank you. And I'll join in on my own prompt here. When we did this work with Spain, we were asked, how do you align a tax system with the SDGs? And like I discussed, we went towards developing a tool for measurement. But I'm still really interested in an idea that we discussed very early in that project, which was to look across a tax system and see where different incentives, different credits, where it aligned or didn't align with the SDGs in terms of, is this pro-poor? Is the system progressive? Do we place subsidies in places that make sense? Are we, enabling or pushing for important technologies or sectors to grow that will help people? And so I think I'm really interested in that sort of audit of a tax system in relation to the SDGs. How do you look across it and see what its overall effects are on things that we care about? So that's work that I'm interested in and hope to pursue in the coming months and years. On that note, we've hit our hour, and I want to first of all thank our tremendous panel, Kenneth, Wazi, and Bernadette. You guys have been tremendous and really learned a lot from you today, and a wealth of experience and different types of experience, from someone sitting in the ministry to someone speaking with corporations to a doctor thinking about pediatrics and where the money comes from to help children. It's just a really, really nice mix, and I really appreciated that a lot. And I want to also thank the audience for joining. I want to thank the comms team for their amazing work setting this up. And then I also want to encourage those who joined today to also think about joining the next talk, which is on the 9th of June. And it's talking about the SDGs as an asset class, getting serious about green finance for development. And I think we've already started to push and probe this question. And is this a good thing? How do we do this well? If we're using the SDGs as a form of conditionality, how do you do that responsibly? And how do you respond to provocations like from Kenneth saying, you can't tell Nigeria what to do? So I think there's a really nice conversation to be had. So please join IIPP again on the 9th of June. This is chaired by Katie Kedward, who's one of our amazing policy fellows. But thank you again to the audience, and a huge thank you to the panelists. Really appreciate your time and your good work. So everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a good evening if you're in the UK time zones, and take care, everyone. Thank you so much.